Apologies for that. Okay. So I'll just repeat my last thought. Migratory animal populations connect broad landscapes and are faced with many threats throughout the annual cycle. So conservation and management planning must occur similarly across space and time. We decided to test some of these effects and explore the demography of a relatively understudied migratory species in North America, the Atlantic brant. Atlantic brant are a small species of Arctic nesting goose, which breed in the Fox Basin of Nunavut, Canada, staged during migration in James Bay, Ontario, Canada, and winter along the mid-Atlantic coast from Massachusetts to North Carolina. In winter, approximately 85% of the population concentrates in the heavily urbanized landscape of coastal New York and New Jersey. Unlike many other duck and goose species, they do not readily consume agricultural grains such as corn. Throughout the annual cycle, brant are dependent on coastal habitats, feeding on submerged aquatic vegetation such as eelgrass and sea lettuce in intertidal areas. Their dependence on coastal habitats makes them particularly vulnerable to coastal habitat destruction, degradation, and anthropogenic disturbance, especially given their wintering range in New York and New Jersey. In the 1930s, a wasting disease caused widespread decline of eelgrass along the Atlantic coast, which at the time was the primary brant forage. And eelgrass beds on the Atlantic coast have never recovered to their historic levels. At this same time, Atlantic brant population crashed, suggesting that cross-seasonal effects during winter could be occurring. More recently, brant have begun foraging on terrestrial vegetation in upland habitats during winter, and now commonly use golf courses, public parks, and ball fields. The bottom left photo here shows brant in a typical intertidal salt marsh habitat, whereas the picture above is of brant in a public park. Atlantic brant are largely understudied relative to other waterfowl populations, and their population is small, estimated at roughly 150,000 birds through an aerial count during winter. They are an important game bird and are iconic to the Atlantic flyway, and harvest management is informed by survival and harvest rates from Atlantic brant that are captured and fitted with metal bands on Arctic breeding areas during the summer, and are subsequently recovered dead by hunters. These efforts have been occurring for the last 2 decades. Like other Arctic nesting geese, adult survival of Atlantic brant is high and relatively stable, suggesting that productivity is the demographic mechanism driving population change. Brant productivity is characterized by boom and bust cycles, whereby years of marked reproductive success can be followed by years of almost complete failure. Annual productivity of Atlantic brant is estimated in November on wintering areas by surveying the proportion of juvenile brant relative to adults. And this plot here shows the proportion of juvenile brant over time, and you can see the dramatic fluctuations of these boom and bust productivity cycles from year to year. However, the environmental drivers of Atlantic brant productivity are poorly understood, and research investigating this is identified as a high priority by the Arctic Goose and Atlantic Coast joint ventures for robust conservation planning of this species. So this prompted the first chapter of my thesis, where I investigated the environmental drivers of Atlantic brant productivity across the annual cycle. Although the primary mechanism for population change comes from their variable boom and bust reproductive patterns, the Atlantic brant population is sensitive to minor variations in their survival, which is high and relatively stable. Because of this sensitivity, we do require reasonable precision in survival estimates to meet population management objectives. I previously mentioned that Atlantic brant survival estimates come from brant captured and marked on breeding areas that are subsequently harvested and reported by hunters in wintering areas. These metal banding and hunter recovery models are commonly used in North American waterfowl management planning, but there are additional data types that could be combined to improve survival estimates for Atlantic brant. Color marking birds and collecting live resightings of unique individuals in the field is one such data type. And some birds are logistically challenging to capture and mark during summer, such as Arctic nesting geese. So there may be utility in marking these birds during other periods of the year, such as during the winter. The color marking and resighting program for Atlantic brant was implemented in 2018 on the wintering grounds. and an analysis of the feasibility of this program to improve Atlantic Brant survival estimates makes up my second chapter. Okay, so the objective of my first chapter again was to investigate the environmental drivers of Atlantic Brant productivity using the long-term November productivity survey dataset. In this survey, the proportion of juvenile to adult brant are determined by the presence of white wing bars on juveniles. So in this photo, the brant in the middle here is a juvenile. We tested the extent to which climate indices, local weather conditions, and snow and ice cover across the annual cycle explained variation in Atlantic brant productivity to determine if cross-seasonal effects were occurring, which again are events during one season that influence subsequent demographic rates. We suspect there are likely effects contributed by broad-scale climatic conditions that populations as a whole experience, effects by local weather conditions, which encompass fine-scale heterogeneity and microclimates individuals experience, and effects of regional snow and ice cover may limit seasonal habitat availability and quality. We were interested in understanding how productivity of Atlantic brant may be driven at all three of these scales across seasons in the annual cycle. Additionally, Atlantic brant have delayed sexual maturity, likely not breeding until at least their third year. Thus, non-breeding subadults compete with breeding adults for resources. We were interested in assessing density dependence related to delayed sexual maturity in brant and see if increased resource competition at greater abundance levels could influence productivity. We hypothesized that harsh environmental conditions experienced during winter, spring staging and migration, and on breeding areas in summer during egg laying, incubation, and early brood rearing would result in reduced productivity of Atlantic brant, but that breeding area conditions would show the strongest relationship because of the immediate implications on reproduction. We also hypothesized that negative density dependence would be operating in the Atlantic brant population, such that increasing abundance would be correlated with reduced productivity. I developed 4 types of covariates across 3 seasons. The North Atlantic Oscillation is a climate phenomena where large-scale pressure differences between the Azores and Iceland result in southerly airflow to the Arctic. This climate phenomena has been correlated with Arctic goose productivity. Strong positive phases of the NAO are associated with cold temperatures, increased severe storms, whereas strong negative NAO phases are associated with warmer temperatures and increased precipitation in the eastern Canadian Arctic where brant breed. So I anticipate that more negative NAO phases will result in favorable conditions for Atlantic brant across the annual cycle. Second, I developed covariates for seasonal weather using combinations of temperature and precipitation data from local weather stations. I developed snow and ice cover terms using a data set with 4-kilometer spatial resolution. And to assess density dependence related to delayed sexual maturity in brant, competition for resources, I included a term for the midwinter survey count of Atlantic brant in the year prior. And for the remainder of the presentation, I will consistently be referring to climate terms and effects with orange text and symbols, weather with blue, and snow and ice cover with yellow. I determined the average daily NAO index between December and February to represent climatic conditions experienced by brant during winter. Using this same interval, I determined the proportion of days where the maximum temperature was below freezing at JFK and Atlantic International Airport weather stations and averaged these two together to create a term for winter severity in the core Atlantic brant wintering range. Then I calculated the maximum number of consecutive days where the proportion of snow and ice cover was greater than 30% on the Atlantic coast, represented in this map here by the yellow shaded area. I developed this term again to represent winter severity by assessing the effect of extended periods of snow and ice cover on key foraging areas. The midwinter survey consists of an aerial survey, aerial count of Atlantic brant on wintering areas of the Atlantic coast, and serves as an index of population abundance, which I used to assess density dependence. I determined a spring interval to coincide with brant staging in James Bay during spring. I again averaged NAO across the spring interval for our climate variable. I determined the average temperature in Moosonee, Ontario, which is located in the southwest corner of James Bay. And I calculated daily snow and ice cover along the coast of James Bay, shaded in yellow on the map, and determined the average percent cover across this spring interval between 20th of May and 20th of June. Lastly, I determined a summer interval to coincide with the nesting and early brood rearing period for Atlantic Brant breeding in the Fox Basin of the Eastern Canadian Arctic. I again averaged NAO across this season. However, I did create two seasonal weather terms during summer in Coral Harbor, which is on Southampton Island of the Fox Basin. First was average temperature, and the second was total precipitation during summer. Warmer temperatures could facilitate earlier spring and summer phenology and availability of suitable nesting locations. It could reduce gosling exposure risk, and combined with increased precipitation, could promote increased vegetation growth for goslings. On June 21st, I calculated the percent of snow and ice covered area in coastal areas of the Fox Basin where Brant are likely to breed, again shaded in yellow on the map, to assess the conditions at the start of the nesting period. I modeled the proportion of juvenile Atlantic Brant from 1977 to 2020 as a function of seasonal weather and seasonal climate variables using generalized linear mixed models in a Bayesian framework. I created a second model to assess the effect of snow and ice cover during winter, spring, and summer on Brant productivity, but I did truncate this time series to 2007 to 2021 because there was limited available covariate data of the snow and ice cover data set. And to assess density dependence related to delayed sexual maturity, I included a term for the midwinter survey count of Atlantic Brant in the year prior in both of these models. I want to note that this midwinter survey term is the only term here that we index by T-1. So for example, a midwinter survey count conducted in January of 2017 will be paired with the proportion of juvenile Brant in November 2018, approximately 22 months between each of these data points. Finally, I included a temporal random effect to account for annual unexplained variation in these models. Okay. These are violin plots illustrating the full posterior distribution shown as shaded gray area on these plots. For each effect in the climate and weather model, the white circle represents the posterior mean, and the vertical white bar represents the 80% credible interval. I considered effects that did not overlap zero in their 80% credible interval as worthy of discussion, and will only be plotting and discussing these. In the climate and weather model, we found the prior midwinter survey strongly and negatively influenced Brant productivity at the climate scale. At the climate scale, we found that only the North Atlantic Oscillation during spring had a strong and negative relationship with productivity. At the weather scale, we found slight positive relationships for the proportion of days below freezing during winter, average temperature during spring, and average temperature during summer in Coral Harbor. In our snow and ice cover model, we again found strong negative density dependent effects. We also found that longer extended periods of snow and ice cover during winter reduced productivity, and the average snow and ice cover during spring in James Bay also negatively influenced productivity. I found evidence for cross-seasonal effects of environmental conditions during winter on Atlantic Brant productivity. In this plot here on the left, the x-axis shows the proportion of days below freezing during winter at JFK Airport and Atlantic City International Airport. And the response is the proportion of juvenile Brant on the y-axis. So as there are more days below freezing during winter, there's actually greater productivity. In this plot here on the right, the x-axis shows the maximum consecutive days where snow and ice covered area on the Atlantic coast was greater than 30%. The response is again the proportion of juvenile Brant. So as maximum length of snow and ice cover during winter increases, so the proportion of juvenile Brant in the population the following November decreases. So interestingly, these effects were inverse of each other, and the positive relationship of Brant productivity increasing with more days with sub-freezing temperatures during winter was opposite to what we hypothesized. The benefit of colder conditions during winter on subsequent productivity may be due to fewer people frequenting golf courses and parks in New Jersey and Long Island during extreme cold temperatures. Golf courses and parks are common and important foraging locations for wintering Brant. So increased anthropogenic disturbance during favorable, warmer winter weather conditions could cause increased energy expenditure or a decreased nutrient acquisition. The negative relationship between fall age ratios and increasing consecutive days with greater than 30% snow and ice cover on the Atlantic coast was likely due to reduced foraging opportunities during extended periods of ice covering coastal embayments containing SAV and snow covering uplands. We did find strong evidence for cross-seasonal effects across all scales examined during spring migration and staging at James Bay on Atlantic Brant productivity. In this plot, the average spring NAO index is on the x-axis with proportion of juvenile Brant on the y. We can see that as the spring NAO increases, the resulting proportion of juvenile Brant decreases. In the Eastern Arctic, negative NAO phases are associated with warmer temperatures and increased precipitation. In this plot, the average temperature during spring in James Bay is on the x-axis, with the response again being proportion of juvenile Brant. We see that Brant productivity increases with temperature during spring in James Bay. In this last plot on the right, we have average snow cover in coastal James Bay during the spring on the x-axis, and we can see that productivity increases when on average there is less snow and ice cover during spring. So warmer temperatures, increased precipitation, and reduced snow and ice cover during this period likely allow for Brant to replenish nutrient reserves quickly after arrival to staging areas in James Bay, and milder conditions at James Bay may better facilitate nutrient acquisition and balance of energy needs to support migration and subsequent productivity. During summer, we found evidence of a breeding season effect of local weather conditions on subsequent productivity. In this plot, on the x-axis is the average temperature during summer in Coral Harbor, and again, proportion of juvenile Brant on the y. In this plot, we can see that as temperature increased during summer, so did the proportion of juvenile Brant. And this could be a result of favorable nesting and brood rearing conditions in the Arctic. We also found strong evidence for density-dependent regulation in Atlantic Brant productivity via the annual population size counted during the midwinter survey in the year prior. So in this plot here on the right, we see that on the x-axis, the midwinter survey lagged by 1 year. As it increases, the proportion of juvenile Brant decreases. So a larger midwinter survey count in the year prior could represent a large proportion of immature, non-breeding subadults present in the population following a boom productivity year that are not contributing to reproductive effort in that year, but competing among other Atlantic Brant for limited resources across the annual cycle. So results from this work suggest that variation in Atlantic Brant productivity over the period 1977 to 2020 was most strongly driven by conditions on staging areas during spring, as we found evidence for cross-seasonal effects across all scales during this period. This spring staging period may be a pinch point in the annual cycle for Atlantic Brant. I also found cross-seasonal effects of winter conditions on Atlantic Brant productivity over this period, and notably I documented contrasting effects of winter regional snow and ice cover and local temperature conditions on productivity. I attributed this to greater levels of anthropogenic disturbance when temperatures were warmer during winter. These findings during spring and winter demonstrate that events well in advance of the breeding season can have strong effects on demography of migratory animal populations. I also found that breeding season conditions had less of an effect on Brant productivity, and summer temperature was the only variable that explains substantial variation in Atlantic Brant productivity. So my results highlight the importance of examining environmental drivers across the entire annual cycle because winter and spring cross-seasonal effects and summer breeding season effects on Atlantic brant productivity were observed, and at differing spatial scales. Further, my results demonstrate that environmental conditions at different spatial scales may explain important and unique variation in demography. So understanding the seasonal drivers of demography is essential for identifying which phase or phases of the annual cycle may be most sensitive and to assist prioritization of conservation and management in space and time for migratory animals. And this work was an important assessment for Atlantic brant and provides an example that can be applied to other migratory animal populations of conservation priority. Future brant research should focus on nutrient dynamics of James Bay staging areas, given the importance of this period on productivity. Additionally, identifying core breeding areas, quantifying reproductive metrics, and determining wintering habitat and space use remain priorities for this understudied species to gain more holistic perspective of brant demography. Okay, now moving into my next chapter. Waterfowl conservation and management in North America is largely informed by survival estimates based on band recoveries from hunter-harvested birds. But recovery data may be sparse for some populations with small banding samples or low recovery rates. Joint encounter models combine live resightings of marked animals with dead recovery models or dead recovery data to estimate survival probability. And such joint encounter models could improve precision in survival estimates relative to those from dead recovery data only. So in my second chapter, I evaluated the feasibility of a capture resighting program to improve survival estimates for Atlantic brant. To do so, I used a combination of empirical field data and simulations. So I used a two-layered approach for the overall objective of assessing improvements in survival estimates in this chapter. This first layer involved determining how precision in survival estimates may change under three different mark recapture frameworks. I first examined a two-season approach. This was designed to represent the addition of winter color marking and resighting to the existing summer metal marking efforts. Next, I looked into survival estimates using a single season approach of color banding just occurring in summer only. And finally, I compared these frameworks to metal banding in summer only, which is the current framework informing harvest management and survival estimates of the Atlantic brant population and can serve as our control. For the second layer of this chapter's objective, I sought to understand how different levels of effort correspond to changes in precision of survival estimates across these three resighting and recapture scenarios I just outlined. So this involved looking at different numbers of captured, color banded, and released birds, and different resighting probabilities. We predicted that precision in survival estimates would increase in joint encounter models compared to dead recovery models because of the additional data type from live resightings. We also predicted that precision in survival estimates from two-season models through the addition of a winter color marking program could improve precision compared to single-season models because we could achieve larger sample sizes given the winter and summer marking efforts combined. Lastly, we hypothesized that increased captures and releases and higher resighting probabilities would increase precision in survival estimates. A color marking program for Atlantic brant was established in 2018, where birds were captured on both Atlantic coast wintering areas and Arctic breeding areas of the Fox Basin. During summer, Atlantic brant were captured using helicopter herding techniques prior to the hunting season and during the flightless stage of molt in July and August. During winter, Atlantic brant were captured using rocket nets, primarily in upland habitats, including ball fields and golf courses on Long Island, New York, New Jersey, and as well as Rhode Island. We use decoys and electronic calls to attract birds close to the net for capture. We had two different color marking schemes I just want to note of plastic colored leg bands containing unique alphanumeric codes. So this bottom left one here is a single leg color band with a geolocator device, which is part of a separate study I won't be reporting on here. To the right of that is a double leg color banding sequence. Atlantic Brant have been marked on Arctic breeding areas since 2000, but with metal bands only. And these efforts I mentioned before, they provide information for harvest management of Brant. During this time period, there have also been infrequent and low intensity efforts of captures and marking during winter with metal bands on the Atlantic coast. But again, I note that in the period 2000 to 2018, capture effort was limited on wintering areas. Resightings were conducted during winter by trained field observers in New Jersey and New York from winters 2019-2020 and 2020-2021. And then in Rhode Island during just winters 2020-2021, resulting in 2 encounter occasions in New York and New Jersey and 1 encounter occasion in Rhode Island. We scanned flocks of Brant, located marked birds, and read unique color marker combinations using spotting scopes, binoculars, and cameras. I developed standard reciting survey routes, which identified locations where Brant were likely to be observed. These consisted primarily of upland habitats, including golf courses and parks, within a heavily urbanized landscape. In this picture, I'm reciting Brant right next to the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn, New York, and that's the Verrazano Bridge in the background. Sometimes my Brant recitings even took me to outdoor aerobics classes at the local rec center. And many folks in natural resources might get assigned all-terrain vehicles or four-wheel drive vehicles for their field work, but a lot of times for this work, a golf cart was the preferred mode of transportation. So here's just an example of a reciting route that I developed as part of this work to really put into perspective the level of urbanization on Brant wintering areas. So you can really see the contrast of the urbanization with the green space from the larger golf courses on here. We developed a 2-season Bayesian multi-state joint encounter model to estimate annual survival, reciting, and recovery probabilities for adult and juvenile Atlantic Brant for the period 2000 to 2021. We structured our empirical model in this 2-season framework to use the full suite of metal banding and color marking information available during winter and summer, though I acknowledge that there's limited color banding information just from 2018 to 2021. So the parameters that are estimated in joint encounter survival models are the survival probability S, the fidelity probability F, which is the probability of remaining in the sampling area, the reciting probability P, and the reported mortality probability R, which we developed using a Sieber parameterization. Because of our 2-season survival modeling framework, I do want to briefly go through a timeline showing all of the data streams and how we arrive at annual survival. So this timeline spans 2 full years and begins with summer capture occasions in July and August. Brant may then be recovered dead during the hunting season or recited alive, and we use these 2 encounter types during this period to jointly estimate survival during the summer season. I want to note that there isn't a harvest opportunity during the winter season between February and June to inform survival estimates this period. And so we were able to derive annual survival using the product of summer and winter survival. The color marking and reciting program for Atlantic Brant is still relatively new and with a limited time series beginning only in 2018. So to evaluate potential for improvement in precision of Atlantic Brant survival estimates with the addition of a winter marking period and reciting data to this existing summer capture effort, we developed a series of scenarios using simulations to reflect 8 total combinations of marking and reciting effort. We used survival, fidelity, and reported mortality probability estimates from empirical models to simulate our data. We selected 4 possible reciting probabilities between 0.05 and 0.35, which was the average from our empirical models. And we also selected 3 capture effort levels of 100, 400, and 850 annual releases during winter. We determined 850 releases during winter was likely the maximum marking capacity during this period, given the current resources. And we applied the average winter age ratio at banding to determine the annual number of releases of adults and juveniles. We simulated 10 years of joint encounter data for each of these scenarios using these parameters. We collapsed the 2-season modeling framework into a simpler single season and single age class modeling framework to represent a scenario of supplemental color marking during the current summer capture efforts. We were interested in evaluating potential improvements here, given the existing effort occurring there. And we wanted to understand improvements in survival when leveraging reciting and recovering data under this single season framework as well. And this could help us draw on utility of the additional wintering efforts as well, if we could compare these two together. So for this single season, single age scenario, we developed 7 total simulation scenarios of varied capture and reciting efforts. Again, we used the survival, fidelity, and reported mortality probabilities from empirical estimates. This time we selected 3 reciting probabilities of 0.04, 0.12, and 0.20. And we selected 3 annual release values of 100, 300, and 500. 500 was selected as the maximum releases of color markers during summer here, because on average, approximately 1,000 Brant are banded during summer. And these metal bands are used to inform harvest management. And so we did not want to, or we did not fully understand the potential for band targeting of color bands yet. So we want to preserve the metal banded sample for this important survival and harvest estimates of this data. We also anticipate that reciting probabilities would be lower for summer marked birds than birds marked on wintering areas where they can be recited where they were marked. And so we did not look at reciting probabilities greater than 0.2 because of this. I also want to note that in the single season, single age class model, we did add annual variation when simulating demographic values. Lastly, we developed 2 dead recovery models to pair with our joint encounter models and understand the potential for improvements between joint encounter models and dead recovery models. So first, I created a 2-season, 2-age class dead recovery model, again with a Sieber parameterization using the same survival and reported mortality probabilities as the other simulations. And I kept releases constant at 1,000 in this model to reflect the current marking efforts in summer that are unlikely to change given the importance for Brant management. And for us to be able to directly compare improvements in precision with the current efforts. I simplified this 2-season, 2-age class dead recovery model into a single season, single age class dead recovery model to directly compare to the single season, single age class joint encounter model of similar structure. With the single season model, I was interested in comparing apples to apples sample sizes here of releases. So I also modeled release values of 100, 300, and 500 in the same way as the joint encounter model. Here I plot the results from our empirical 2-season, 2-age class joint encounter survival model. With survival probability on the y-axis here and time on the x-axis. Vertical error bars in these plots represent the 95% credible interval width of the posterior estimate. From 2000 to 2021, mean adult Atlantic Brant survival during summer was 0.91 and during winter was 0.96. Juvenile seasonal survival estimates were highly imprecise over this period. Winter banding information was sparse across this period, so I do suggest caution when interpreting results of seasonal survival estimates for both juvenile and adults here. Rather, greater inference can be drawn from annual survival estimates derived in this model through the multiplication of the seasonal estimates. Overall, juvenile annual survival was still highly imprecise with this two-season modeling framework across the period, measured by the 95% credible interval width, which was on average 0.5 for juvenile survival estimates across this period. Mean precision for adult annual survival was 0.17 across this period, and annual adult survival estimates range between a minimum of 0.88 and a maximum of 0.94 between this period, 2000 to 2021. Here I present violin plots showing the posterior distribution of reported mortality probabilities and the reciting probability estimates by marker type for our empirical model. The white dot is the mean estimate. The vertical white bar is again 95% credible interval, and the gray shaded violin is the posterior distribution. So reported mortality probability estimates for the two-season, two-age class joint encounter model appear to be skewed high for all marker types, given the mean estimates hovering around 0.4 for all of them. Also, these reported mortality probability estimates are highly imprecise given the size of the width of the distribution and 95% credible interval. Color markers have only been deployed since 2018, so this short time series could cause imprecision in these estimates, but we do observe this same trend in imprecision and skewed high for the metal band only. And so dead recovery models using the same summer metal banding information, they estimate reported mortality probability at around 0.23. So we suspect these, we encountered challenges estimating reported mortality probability under this two-season framework due to the lack of recovery information during one of the two seasons and inability to leverage the recent reciting information just from the most recent 3 years. Mean reciting probability for double color marked Atlantic Brant was 0.52, and for single-legged geolocator marked birds was 0.35. Next, I present results from the two-season, two-age class simulation scenarios. The horizontal dashed line across these plots represent the value that I used to simulate the survival parameters. Under the lowest release scenario here of 100 total color marked birds annually, of which 88 were adults and 12 were juveniles, survival estimates from joint encounter models were more imprecise than dead recovery models for both adults and juveniles. Under the highest release scenario of 850 total color marked birds released annually, 178 being adults, 122 being juveniles, we only saw a slight improvement in precision of adult survival estimates from joint encounter models compared to the dead recovery model, only under the highest reciting probability of 0.35. And overall, there was a negative bias in adult survival estimates from the joint encounter models under all scenarios, except for the lowest reciting and release effort. Last are results from the simplified single season and single age class simulation scenarios. A plot of survival probability over time here is on the left, and reported mortality probability estimates over time is on the right. In these scenarios, I want to note that we did add annual variation to the simulated survival and reported mortality probabilities. So the values used to generate the data are the light gray dots after each year's last survival and reported mortality probability estimates. So this first set of plots here on the top shows the lowest release effort of 100 birds annually. This next set of plots shows the highest release effort of 500 birds annually. And again, we did not see improvements in precision of survival estimates in joint encounter models compared to dead recovery models across the suite of simulation scenarios with varied capture and reciting effort. However, I do want to note that joint encounter models here did capture time-dependent variation in survival estimates better than the dead recovery models, which you can see the black dots are the dead recovery models, and they tended to produce time-dependent estimates that were more centered around the overall mean. And a trend overall was that precision in survival estimates for both joint encounter and dead recovery models did improve with increased sample sizes of annual releases. So overall, we found that a 2-season joint encounter survival model did not result in precise seasonal or annual survival estimates because our encounter occasions were limited to just 1 season, and our modeling framework, while mathematically complex, could not quite leverage the data from both seasons to estimate latent parameters of this model. A modified framework using Markov chain Monte Carlo variance covariance matrices from 2-season joint encounter survival models could be explored further to strengthen our capacity to estimate seasonal survival, given the challenges that we experienced with recoveries only happening during one of the seasons. Our single-season joint encounter model did not yield significant improvements either in survival estimates compared to dead recovery models, likely because we're limited in sample size based on the number of annual releases and reciting probabilities that reflected realistic Brant effort scenarios. And these were just too low to realize these benefits. So we never reached sample sizes large enough to realize the benefits of combining live and dead encounter data, given the additional complexity. Therefore, in both 2-season and single-season joint encounter survival models using simulated data, we still found it challenging to leverage reciting and recovery data and represent Atlantic Brant ecology. We suspect that there could be simulated dead recovery models could be slightly more precise than those that would be produced with empirical data, and so we do suggest exploration of simulations further. These findings suggest that further exploration of a single-season model which incorporates both metal and color bands to improve precision in survival estimates could be the most beneficial at this time. We demonstrated that a simpler approach of single-season model, either dead recovery or joint encounter, rather than 2-season joint encounter models, have the greatest potential to improve precision of survival estimates. So for future conservation planning of Atlantic Brant, due to the set months of harvest seasons and the sample sizes that we are likely to achieve of marked birds, color marking should also continue because there are other features of these data that could inform survival, lifetime reproductive success, and associations among individuals. But these are not yet realized because we haven't been marking for long enough. So there are many people and organizations that made this project possible, and I'm so lucky to have worked with such a fantastic team. I'd like to thank each and every one of these folks for their important roles on this project. And again, I want to state that the project was supported through the Arctic Goose Joint Venture and matching funds from the Canadian Wildlife Service, New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So thank every single one of you guys for your support on this project. And with that, I will take any questions.
Very nice, Fran. Thanks for the talk. Questions from the group? Feel free to unmute and ask or put it in the chat, either way.
Hey, Fran, it's Frank Baldwin here. I can't figure out how to turn my video on. Sorry for that. I just had, great presentation. I just had a question about, I wondered about, right now you're using recites from your kind of coordinated structured survey and along with some of the partners. And I just wondered if you looked in the banding database on and what sort of additional information you might get from just general public resightings, like that might be available, you know, through the banding lab. I know a lot of photographers are taking pictures. We see quite a few recoveries on the report to banders. So just wondered if you could comment if there's potential to increase, you know, I guess if the benefits maybe of increasing that amount of data, you know, if there's a cost of data quality or what that potential, you know, proportional increase might look like in resightings.
Yeah, that's a great question, because the Brant are obviously in these really urban environments where there are lots of people and lots of photographers. So there's potential for sort of citizen science opportunities. I have not explicitly looked at the number of resightings that could be added from just reports from eBird or ones that are sent directly to the BBL. So that is something that I could look into. I haven't done that yet, but I will say I think it would be important with those. The only resightings that would probably be of value are ones that have photographs documenting the code, just because we do sort of describe the codes in a particular sequence. And I think with the addition of observers that are not trained, it could just, you know, like you said, it could add additional errors in the detection of birds. And so that's one thing that we would like to control, because it's an assumption of the model that we don't incorrectly assign birds to a state, so we don't observe them when they weren't actually there. So I think the utility would be from pictures documenting it, and that would have to be explored further.
Great, thanks.
Other questions for Fran?
Mitch, maybe I'll jump in quick. This is Tony Roberts. So Fran, so obviously increasing effort on any of these resightings or bannings costs money, right? So did you explore anything or present anything in your thesis about like the different cost of adding a resighting program or adding a winter banning program or color banning program?
I did not look at specific like financial costs of that. If that's what you were asking, I just basically looked at potential resighting rates and what it could achieve in terms of the survival estimation capacity.
Great. No, that's kind of what I figured. Thanks. Because just with Frank's question as well of utilizing some photos like to increase the resightings without increasing manager effort in getting those resightings as well. But no, great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll jump in 1 second, Fran. Tony, yeah, that's really, at the end of the day, that's sort of the bottom line on this work, is learning the financial results of different effort. And so one of the next steps I can see is translating these different resighting probabilities to actual effort in terms of personnel and logistics. And then of course the associated finances of doing that. So the number of hours or the number of routes, or there are various ways I'm sure we can do this. So yeah, I think we can leverage the resighting probabilities in that way.
Thanks, Mitch. And yeah, this is probably outside Fran's work, but certainly then how does that affect the decision as well? And at the end, right? Like, does increased precision really affect the management decision?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think it's some interesting discussion about what folks are happy with in terms of precision. You know, are you happy with tighter or not, given the money involved? So that will be a really interesting component in the months ahead.
Fran, this is Matt Frackleton. Great job. I was just wondering, you mentioned kind of the hunter targeting of bands. I was wondering if you had enough data to kind of compare the different marking or band types and see if there were different harvest mortalities based on either the color or the geolocator or just the regular metal band.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know I think we would love to get there eventually, but it doesn't seem like we can do that just with the about 3 years of data that we have right now. And then of course it got a little bit complicated with the 2-season modeling framework. So again, I think it's going to take a couple more years before we can make any conclusions about that. But there's obviously speculation that things could be happening.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Hey, Fran, this is Sarah Fleming. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm driving. I do look forward to chatting with you more about this since I missed some of your presentation, just due to the fact that tell me what you most enjoyed about your work.
Oh my gosh. Wow, that's a tough one. It's been a lot of fun this whole time. I would say I have most enjoyed the field work and getting to know the Brant and spending so much time in New York and New Jersey, just seeing what they were doing, because it was really, really interesting, and to just see them in those environments and just how they go up to the Arctic later and just breed there and then come back, and then they're on the Belt Parkway next to the Brooklyn Bridge. It's just really, really interesting to see that. So it's been a lot of fun working on that. And then of course to see actual survival and productivity estimates is really interesting too, because personally, I'm just really interested in like population demography and trends and how different things can impact that. So that's been a lot of fun to explore.
Great. Well, thank you, and good luck in your next endeavors.
Thank you.
Other questions for Fran? One last opportunity.
Hey, Fran, this is Nick Furman. Great job. I was hoping you could kind of speak to how you developed kind of that reciting, those reciting locations. Was a lot of it anecdotal where you guys had seen Brant before? You know, was that kind of a work in progress and you were adding and removing locations? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So it was definitely a work in progress the whole time, but a lot of the personnel that were in New Jersey and Long Island already, they did have a good idea of spots where the Brant would be found. They had a lot of great marking locations already, but we did find that sometimes these Brant would use these tiny little fields, sort of a little bit off the beaten path, not even right next to the water. And so we were constantly adding sites to the list, and we tried to prioritize it and label them by its, being actively used. There's Brant sign here, or because sometimes across years, the birds would be using the same places, and then in other years, they wouldn't be using those places. So we did try and keep tabs on it, and it always was a work in progress, and just sort of, we traveled around and hoped that we saw birds in the areas that we might expect them to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Okay. I think let's leave it there. Please, everyone, join me in congratulating Fran on an excellent few years and an excellent defense seminar. Nice job, Fran. Thanks
you.
everyone for joining today. Of course, if you have additional questions, welcome to contact Fran. And yeah, I look forward to seeing this work published in the coming months and years. Hope everyone has a great weekend, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Brant, there's a separate link for the actual defense, right?
Yes, I guess.
Okay.
Should I go in there and start that, or do I have to start it because it's mine? Actually,
I don't know.
I think I might have to start it, and then maybe I will leave.
All right. See you in a few minutes.
Yes.